There we go. All right. Well, welcome to DevSig, everybody. Thanks for coming. Like I said, it's great to see some people outside of my regular meeting circles, and we'll try to keep some of these up. But if anybody else wants to present or has ideas on things to present, that'd be great. This is just something that I've recently given a shot and turned into a little bit of a presentation with some fun. A look back at my history of writing code. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Tim Allen. I'm an IT director with Word and Research Data Services. My co-organizers at DevSig, Donna and Matt, are here as well. I'm going to run through a few slides here and then do a live demo, so prepare to laugh at me as things go up in flames. We'll start with a brief history of my development timeline, so prepare to laugh again there. But let's start at the beginning. So my dad's best man lived 3 doors down from us at 45th and Spruce, my Uncle Charlie. And he wrote a book in 1974 called An Introduction to the Theory of Computing. He was a computer science professor at Temple, one of the first computer science professors ever. And he programmed assembly language and literally wrote the book on the PDP-11. He programmed the assembly code for the Parker Brothers game Simon. And unfortunately for him, he took a one-time payout for that work rather than a cut of sales, which is really a shame because I think pretty much every kid since the 70s has owned that game at one point in their life, the memory game with the buttons and the sounds. So I started playing with computers at a very, very young age at his house. And after that, this was my first development environment. So long before the IDE or anything like that, my mom won a raffle at our local church, right at 40th and Locust Walk, St. Mary's. And it was for me to take a free summer program course at the Montgomery Country Day School on Montgomery Avenue in Wynwood. And it was one of these like 5 weeks of summer camp where you took a course that was kind of fun but educational in the beginning and then did a sport in the afternoon. And when I saw that there was a computer course offered, well, that was it. That's what I was going to take. I'd already started bashing on keyboards with 8-inch floppy disks at my Uncle Charlie's place and absolutely loved it. And, was really excited by the prospect. And when I got there, there were Apple II Pluses and Commodore Pets. I'm not sure exactly which one I wrote my first line of code on, but I was 6 years old and introduced to BASIC on these 2 machines. And my first program is probably one that some of you will recognize, which was 10 print Tim, 20 go to 10, and then run to make my name appear all over the screen in various different kinds of patterns. And depending on how many spaces you put at the end after Tim before the secondary quote, it would appear in different sequences because of the column restrictions of the two different computers. I also remember the Commodore Pet was pretty neat because it had a modifier key with special characters under each key. If you look carefully actually at the keyboard on the underside front of the key, you can see there were all kinds of blocks and shapes that you could make things with. And I eventually learned how to print Tim in big letters with it across the screen. So this is my first program, and I think many people would argue that it's been downhill since then. But thanks to the University of Pennsylvania, a couple of years after that, my dad brought home one of these from Penn. And I think this was probably around 1982 or 1983 or so. First brought home an IBM PC, then we added a 10 meg hard drive to it, which was really, increased the speed and the capacity like you wouldn't believe before. And then eventually an EGA monitor. And our goal here was we actually became the team at Penn that was the first team to get Arabic to appear on a computer screen. So my dad and I kind of learned DOS together. And my BASIC that I remembered from that course kind of transferred over to PC BASIC and then eventually GW BASIC. So my father had started with basic Pascal, so I soon started to pick up Pascal, write lin instead of print. And at school, I was lucky enough that we had a computer program, so I was beginning to program Apple BASIC at home and then sticking with PC and GW BASIC, when I was at home rather than at school. And 1984 rolled around, and this kind of changed everything. It was very interesting because Penn got a bunch of these, and my dad got to bring one home for a couple of weeks to see, if it might be easier to get the foreign character sets he was working with on. Um, but I had no idea. So this was my first encounter with a mouse, and it was very interesting because I had no concept of how to use it. My only point of reference for anything like this after looking at it was the 1980s game Centipede, where you had a trackball and a button. So I had immediately picked up the mouse upside down and was trying to use it as a trackball, and everything was in reverse and going backwards and trying to click underneath. And it wasn't until I saw somebody else use it that I actually got what was going on. So that was interesting. But all these different components were starting to come together. Gloriously stolen from Xerox. Thank you, Xerox, for your contribution to computing, and leading slowly but surely to what we consider the modern day IDE. I got my first email account in 1986, again, thanks to Penn. My first email account ever was tallen@charity.sas.upenn.edu. Charity.sas was a next step pizza box. And this is where I first learned to use email with the Elm and Pine text email clients. And both of them had a weird text editor in them that had to be used for writing emails called Emacs. So to this day, I continue to use Emacs in terminal settings. This is really the reason I learned Emacs, was it was the only way I could send email. I didn't know at the time that I could change settings and change my editor to be something else. And why would I want to? Because Emacs is pretty much the perfect editor. You can see on the right in the screenshot, I still actually use it for Python development. It does syntax highlighting. It can do line numbers. It can do autocomplete. It's still a very, very extensible editor. People may not think the keystrokes are that natural, but since I've been using them since I was about 12 years old, it is second nature to me. And it could be argued in many ways that Emacs was the first modern IDE. A lot of the features it offered of being able to have sort of a very pluggable architecture, about being able to bring in different components, about being able to have your database write in a different buffer than your code and flip back and forth to them. It gave a lot of things that modern developers rely on in sort of point and click interfaces. And it's the only thing from back then in 1986 that I still use at every job I've had. So I haven't had a job where I don't use Emacs. So it's been continuing to serve me well over the years. When I got to high school, I mainly programmed Pascal and some C, and that introduced me to Borland's Turbo Pascal on PCs. And this is the first language and environment I encountered. I was used to, BASIC, where you could just type in a command and see what it did immediately without really thinking about it, and, going through line numbers and renums and things like that. Whereas in Turbo Pascal, you had to write procedures, you had to put them together, you had to compile it, and it was also the first time I could create an executable. You'll also see that this is the first time on any of these interfaces where we've seen things such as debug and break or watch. So it's interesting that modern things like a debugger and breakpoints were starting to be seen by the mid-1980s in sort of a more GUI-like interface, at least an interface where, there's a menu at the top and different sections that you have to go through, and, even using the function keys for bringing up menus, making things, stepping through, stack traces, things of that nature. And you can also see that, Borland C would evolve sort of right out of this for anybody who ever worked with that as well. So this interface became pretty familiar to me, and I learned how to hack it and make it so you could change all the colors to purple. It was really quite a beautiful thing. My high school computer science teacher is still a good friend of mine, but he was colorblind and would always curse me for the different color schemes I would come up with. Moving on to by a couple of years, when I got to Wharton, the editors of choice for use at Wharton were Eclipse and CF Eclipse, and for my workflow, these seemed bloated and brutal. Um, Eclipse was huge and a total resource hog, and the instructions we had for installation of it for Cold Fusion were 3 full pages long on 8.5 by 11 single spaced. So getting it installed was not easy, and it really took over your machine and caused a lot of deep thinks. So there would be times where it would just decide, oh, it needed to do a cleanup of an index or something, and you'd be sitting there for 4 minutes twiddling your thumbs while Eclipse decided to either come back to life or just as frequently not come back to life, and then you'd have to do a complete and total restall again. Some of my members on the Words team who've been around long enough remember the dark days of Eclipse. And its integrations often crashed, forcing you to uninstall and reinstall from scratch. And to say I'm not a fan would be a bit of a huge understatement. Fortunately, that did not last too long, and soon enough I was able to kind of come up with my own environment. And first with the command line and TextMate, and then eventually I went from TextMate to Sublime when TextMate development pretty much came to a grinding halt. And this is where I've sort of lived for the past 8 years or so. And, I still think this is a very good way to develop. Sublime is such a lightweight editor that it really doesn't take over your host machine. That lightweight allowed me to develop on remote servers using Samba for mount points as well as locally. And it has such a rich ecosystem of plugins that it's still definitely a text editor rather than an IDE, but it kind of bridges that gap. And, using command line tools, you can see in the screenshot on the left my Git hist map where I've got a full Git history mapped out where you can follow branches with full colors. I had hit a pretty good groove here and found myself being pretty efficient at this time. I never really took to PyCharm as much as I'm a big fan of people who work for JetBrains and really appreciate what they've done for the Django community with PyCharm sales. But PyCharm never really took for me because, again, it got back to being a bit of a hog. I don't like needing a full Java runtime environment on my machine for a text editor. And its Python IntelliSense I never found to be that good. There were probably things you could do to extend it, but it didn't always create PEP 8 compliant code. It didn't tell me when I had imported a module that was no longer used. And Sublime did these things for me that was absolutely wonderful. The Anaconda, not to be confused with the Anaconda scientific packages, but the Anaconda plugin for Sublime, its IntelliSense is absolutely wonderful. And I threw in a couple others, and it worked out really well for me for a couple of years. But it wasn't long before, it wasn't until recently that I decided to give VSCode a shot. So VSCode to me is the best of all worlds, and I'll show you why in a couple of minutes. But Frank Wiles, the president of the Django Software Foundation, gave me a good quote when I was talking to him about it. He said it's Sublime Text Plus. It's extremely lightweight, and it allows me to develop in all the environments that I work in. Sublime does as well, but it's not aware of those environments in the same way that VS Code is. VS Code is very aware of when I'm developing on a server, of when I'm developing in WSL2, the Windows Subsystem for Linux. It's aware of Docker, whereas when I develop on a server in Sublime, if I had a mount point from a Linux server mounted by Samba on Windows to do Sublime development, it only thought of it as a Windows folder. It did not think of it as a Linux system, where VS Code is aware. VS Code has an extremely active extension ecosystem. So I've managed to find enough to basically replicate all the functionality I loved in Sublime within VS Code. And it's also allowed me to do things like, there's support for SAS, believe it or not, within VS Code. So you can do SAS syntax highlighting. It also supports all 3 platforms I use. So I work on Windows, I work on Mac, I work on Linux. And it runs the same on all 3, which is really a key point for me because I can use the same editor across all the platforms I go to. So, but whatever platform I'm on, I will feel comfortable. And my settings also follow my projects on all three. So if I'm on a PC at home or a Mac at my girlfriend's place, if I'm on a remote server doing development, it'll have my same settings in that editor across all three. It's pretty slick the way it does it. So that's I believe the end of my slides. So without further ado, why don't we try to do a live demo here and prepare to laugh. I will stop sharing over here and grab it over here. So welcome to VSCode. So what we're looking at right here, if you've never seen it before, is VSCode on a remote server. And I will bring up a Python file, so you can see that I can have multiple windows. I can also have multiple terminals down here, which is a feature I like. And I often flip back and forth between the command line and terminals. And a handy shortcut I just learned this week is Control Backtick. Control Backtick will allow me to show and hide the terminal. So I can, in a straightforward method there, I've just got my code. If I want to bring up my terminal, I can hit Control Backtick. So it's a straightforward way to go back and forth and maximize screen real estate. So you'll see here, I've actually got, this is one major advantage of VS Code. And what I'm using right now are the remote plugins. So the first thing I'm going to talk about are the remote plugins. There are three parts to this remote plugin architecture. One that lets you develop over SSH on a remote server, one that lets you develop with Docker, and one that lets you develop with the Windows Subsystem for Linux. So the one we're looking at right now, I am actually on a remote server that you can see down here, words.pub1dev.wharton.upenn.edu. And wiring it up is surprisingly straightforward. So I'll go ahead and bring up the command palette. And if I hit remote SSH connect to host, you'll see I already have one saved here, but I can add a new SSH host. So let's say I want to develop on the words cloud. Enter. Host added. Connect. It has used my keys. And we are on. So now you'll see I am on a remote server. So when I go to open folder, it's not showing me what's in Windows. It's by default showing me what is on that remote server. So over here, I can come to show local if I want, and that will show me my local Windows machine. But I want to open up a folder on the remote server called Python scripts. I've got it set to open up a new window for each folder, so that's why it keeps popping it up. You can set it up differently if you like. And within here, I've got an example of, let's open up test.py. And you'll see no Python interpreter is selected. You need to select a Python interpreter to enable features such as IntelliSense, linting, and debugging. It's very smart. It will tell you each step of the way what you need to do. So if I go ahead and open a different folder, SAS, it'll open up in a new window. And you'll see within here, I've already installed on Words Cloud a SAS syntax highlighter. Within this ecosystem of extensions down here, you can see that there are all kinds of options. And it'll show you what I have installed locally, as well as what I have installed on the server. Some have to be installed on the server, so they can run both remotely and locally. And I'll show you in a minute how cool that is. But this gives you an idea of how big an ecosystem there is. You know, there's every kind of plugin for every kind of language you could imagine is pretty much there. If you want to program in Julia, you can, search Julia, and there's Julia language support, Markdown Julia, Julia formatter. There's there's more than you can imagine. If you want to program, I don't know, Cold Fusion, let's see. There's actually CFML and Cold Fusion support. Lots of it. Another cool thing to see here is, so I'm going to bring up my task manager. And if you take a look here under Visual Studio Code, despite me having several open, more than several, look how much CPU and memory total it's taking for all of those. So it's 3 gigs of RAM and almost no CPU. Or sorry, that was Firefox, even less than that. So if we look at this top row right here, it's less than a gig of RAM, 0.3% of CPU. And I will keep that over here so you can see while I'm actively working how much it actually takes. Because it really is not much, even with my full development environment for all of Words right here. Of course, it's not going to make that easy. But you see, it can jump up to about 10 to 20% when it's in active use. But it's not a big resource hog. So it's pretty cool. And it's got a debugger with breakpoints built in. So if I come over here, you'll see that I've actually got it up and running. But if I hit stop, you'll see it stops the runner. But you can define different kinds of debuggers. So I've defined one for Django here. So if I come to launch.json, you'll see I've actually set it up to run Django's management command, run server, and run it on a specific port. This also turns on debug toolbar. I'm going to go ahead and turn that off for a second. Let's see if this actually turns it off. And then once I hit play, you'll see it launches here. Now what's going on over here is pretty interesting. So over SSH, what VS Code for SSH has done is uploaded a web service via SSH from my local machine to the machine I'm doing the work on. So you'll see here in the area I highlight that it has actually uploaded to home words TL in my home directory up there a full extension called Launcher. And what that launcher does is allows the local editor to communicate to the remote server. It gives it all the information it needs for doing things like stack traces, for doing things like breakpoints. It allows it to communicate back and forth with the editor as if it were local. So this is a really nice feature that is plug and play as far as I can tell. It didn't take me any longer than 5 minutes to get to it. But let's say, for example, I wanted to insert a breakpoint. I'll just come to the management file here, where we're setting the environment. But before we fully fire up Django, and I'm just gonna set a variable called blah equal to hello world. And then I'll insert a breakpoint right here where I want to stop. And now when I fire it up, it'll take a few seconds to come up, and then we'll have a look. Of course, now it's deciding to freeze. Oh no, there it is. Okay, so it's actually stopped. There you go. So you'll see um, it actually stopped here, so it didn't come up. So it's doing exactly what it should. And you'll see that it hasn't run hello world yet. So when I print blah, it's not defined. But when I print environment, it is set environment to be user. So you'll see here, it gives me all the local variables at that point, at this breakpoint. So if I move the breakpoint to the next line, if I go ahead and stop, move the breakpoint here, hit play again, if I come back to the debug console now and print blah, you'll see this time, oh, it stopped before, hang on. Okay, you'll see that blah is now defined. And over here, I can go ahead and define whatever I want. So it gives you the debug console right here where I can just type Python code in here and see whatever I want, as well as letting me see all the variables that are defined at that breakpoint. And if I go ahead and tell it to continue, step over, step over, step over, it will continue to play. And if we come back to the terminal now, you'll see that it's spawning the full run server. So for being able to run on a remote server, this is pretty slick. So I can put a breakpoint anywhere I like in any view or form or model, and jump right in there and see what I want at any point, which is a pretty standard feature of most IDEs when you're doing local development. But this is the best I've seen for being able to do it remotely. So again, this is connecting to a remote Linux server all over SSH, words pub1dev.wharton.upenn.edu. So none of this is running on my local machine. There's some advantages to this. So my code stays on a central server, so no matter where I'm doing the work from, I can access it. Also, we have a fair amount of developers who maybe spend 5 to 10% of their time developing in Django. They're more on the data side, but occasionally have to plug their data in. This allows us to provide them an environment that they don't have to maintain. There's a lot of churn in the development world. As you've seen from my presentation, there's a heck of a lot of churn in the development world, especially if you get into things like JavaScript, but even on the Django backend side, there's a lot of churn. This allows us to manage one centralized installation development environment where our developers can do their work, so they don't have to worry about it. They can just get about to doing their work and still have a fully featured IDE experience without having to SSH manually into the machine and use Vim or something like that, or Emacs. It gives a more flexible work environment. So I found this SSH plugin to be a big help. It also allows us to eliminate Samba from our requirements for developers to be able to develop on remote servers, and that's a big win. Samba's had some pretty big security issues over the past couple of years, and it's being less and less supported centrally. So the more we can do to remove Samba from our stack and rely on SSH, the better. And it's done a really great job at that. Similarly, if I go ahead and I'm going to go ahead and stop this on the remote server, this allows me to connect to WSL too. For those who aren't familiar with WSL, it's the Windows Subsystem for Linux. And a couple years ago, Microsoft first released the Windows Subsystem for Linux, but it was incredibly slow because it didn't actually have a Linux kernel. And in addition, every file that you used had to be translated from Linux format to Windows. So during that process, for example, during a pip install, everything would have to be translated. WSL2 has removed this barrier, and it's about 5 to 10 times as fast for doing pip installs. So it's now a great way to develop locally. An advantage to using WSL2 over something like Vagrant, for example, is that it actually shares the memory with your host machine. So with Vagrant, I always, if I had a 16 gig machine, I'd have to say, give 6 to Vagrant or give 8 to Vagrant. And then I'd only have 8 on the host machine. Instead, this shares it. So WSL2 only grabs as much memory as it needs. And then when it's done with it, it gives it back to the host operating system. So there's no longer cutting out a huge chunk of memory that you might only need here and there and always having it taken up, making it a huge memory hog. So that's a big win. If we take a look, I'm going to drag in my my WSL screen. You'll see right here that this is actually running on my desktop, but it's a full Linux kernel. So if I type away, you'll see that I'm here on a Linux kernel, but I can go explorer.exe, and it will actually bring up in Windows directly from the WSL2 Explorer a Windows dialog for me to browse the folders. And you'll see it actually attaches WSL. It's pretty slick the way it does it. It attaches the local guest Linux kernel as a mount point under your network drives. So it goes network, WSL $, and then Ubuntu 18.04 is the one I'm running locally, and then my home directory, and then T-Allen. And on this side, I can actually see both of my hard drives. So if I do ls-l mnt/c, you'll see there's my C drive. And there's certain ones that it doesn't recognize on the Linux side, which is just fine, but you can actually access things back and forth in a fairly straightforward manner using both the host and the guest operating system. To connect to your local WSL, it's again really straightforward. If I bring up the command palette and I do Remote WSL, new window, it pops right up. And you'll see here that if I go to open folder, it's already got me at home T-Allen rather than my, and again with the show local option, it's pretty much the same interface as SSH, but this is all local to that Linux kernel on my machine. So if I come into projects and I bring up my personal website, PyPhilly, again, I've got it set to open up a new window anytime I open up a folder. That's just my preference. I'd like to have I keep all my work folder by folder for projects. So whenever I open up a new one, I keep a different project in each of these VS Code windows you see at the bottom. So if we take a look here at PyPhilly, there's a manage.py command, and it's also smart. So you'll see it says no Python interpreter is selected. So I need to select a Python interpreter, but there's no virtual environment here. So if I go ahead and X that out for a second, it's still going to tell me to select the Python interpreter here. But if I fire up the terminal, it's smart enough to bring me right to PyPhilly. So if I do Python 3.6, make sure it's there. It is. If I do Python 3.6-m VM and make a virtual environment, you'll see that this pop-up comes down in the lower right. We noticed a new virtual environment has been created. Do you want to select it for the workspace folder? Yes. And then you'll see over here that it has automatically selected it for me. Oh, and look, it knows that Pylint isn't installed. But I want a different Pylinter. I want Flake 8. Flake 8 is not installed. It will install it. And now I've got a full linter. So you'll see that it's smart enough that it's firing up the terminal and installing it in WSL. So it has successfully installed Flake 8 for me. So now if I import from datetime, import datetime, and go ahead and save, you'll see it's smart enough that it's detected a problem here. So if I come over to problems, you'll see datetime imported but unused. So it's smart enough to tell me that, oh, I've imported something I don't need to. So if I go ahead and remove that and save it, you'll see Django imported but unused, Yeah, I know that because we're doing a try with an accept, which is absolutely fine because it'll get used later. And it's smart enough that, if I put white space at the end of a line, it sees that there's trailing white space right there. I can just click on it, get rid of it. So all of that is really from a fresh project. So it's pretty incredible how this is all integrated. And you get those same kind of tools, whether you're developing locally, whether you're developing with Docker, whether you're developing over SSH on a remote server, or whether you're developing with the Windows Subsystem for Linux. It's really been pretty incredible. And Git is integrated right on board. So I can come over here to Git, and I found a great plugin called Git Lens. So if I come here in the code base over to, I know users is a very busy spot for us. You'll see here that for each section, it will tell me for the line I'm on, it'll tell me who last modified it over here. So who I can blame. You, 2 months ago, fixed backwards breaking. I'll actually switch this over to just, I'll close this out so we have more room to work with. You'll see that I can blame Ryan for this one. Ryan Sullivan a year ago, and it gives me the commit message. Disable create LDAP user and set password function for now. You'll see within each block, it tells you who wrote the class, who last updated that class. So some of these plugins and snippets are absolutely wonderful, and I don't know how I could live without them now. So I know I've thrown a lot at you with all that, but it's come an incredibly long way. For such a lightweight editor, it gives so much, and it's only taken me about a week or two to really get used to and get comfortable with, because I only really started using it a few months ago. And now, I'm already one of its biggest proponents. So I think I'll end there, but would love to hear any questions that anybody has, or any feedback or ideas that you've had with VSCode. So thanks a lot for letting me show you all that. Any questions?
Tim, what is it missing from your perspective? Like, what do you miss the most that you're saying, wow, they should really add this next year or something?
So the one part that I have not found a really satisfactory piece for is database integration yet. I've tried a couple of the different plugins for it to access Postgres, and they've all been very tedious to get working. And sometimes I'll get them working once, but won't be able to get them working again. Because it would be nice. I don't expect a full database GUI or anything like that, but it would be nice to be able to browse data a little more easily than anything I've found. And one thing I do want is a database IDE that a database IDE that lets me connect to multiple databases. So there was a decent one for Postgres I had found, but I haven't found one. I haven't found one for any others yet. And I'd like sort of an all-included one, just for my own purposes.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Hey, Tim, it's Matt.
Hey, Matt.
Hey, I was wondering, have you tried using MyPy with that?
I haven't yet, no.
Okay.
So, but it's an interesting question. If I bring up screen share again, this will be an interesting test. So let's just have a look down here, down in extensions. Type checking for Python using MyPy. There you go. So somebody's already written something. So if you bring it up, there's normally a README for any of these extensions that comes right up.
Mm-hmm.
And it tells you what context it runs within. So I'm going to kill off the terminal real quick. But runs MyPy on Python code to provide type checking. So there are some training wheels for it appears.
Okay, that's good.
Is anyone else using VSCode? Well, maybe we should have a VS Code party at some point if people want help setting it up. But in all honesty, for me, it was straightforward enough to go to the download and then just start hacking around, because so many of those IntelliSense pop-ups you saw down here sort of walked me through the entire process of what I wanted to find. It was a really nice experience.
Hey, Tim, I have a question in Slack for you. Slack, sorry, chat. I was wondering if there's a way to compile a base set of extensions and settings that you can publish for easy consumption by a new member of the team.
That's an interesting question. So one easy way to do it is to pass around settings files, which is what I've done with some members of my team. So here under VS Code, you'll see here's my settings file. Just copy and paste that JSON and say, hey, put this in your settings. And VS Code is bright enough to figure it out, what extensions you need to make that work. There is a settings share app, which allows you to share settings via GitHub GIS, but I haven't played with it fully yet. But if you come into extensions, there's I think it's called Settings Sync, maybe? Yeah, Settings Sync. So synchronize settings, snippets, and such via GitHub. So so use your GitHub account token in Gist. So via Gist, you can share settings.
There you go. Number 6 on that list. I love it.
And if you're a Sublime user like me, right beneath it is a Sublime text key map and settings importer. So you can get a head start looking like Sublime if you want.
Thank you for this. It's you put a lot of research into the subject you prepared for this. It's cool.
Thanks.
So thank you for presenting.
Tim, quick question. It's Nico here.
Sure.
Kind of similar to John's question. Do you was there anything with WSL2 that you've kind of not been happy with? I mean, the latest release.
So WSL2 has come a long way. I was with it from the bumpy beginnings. So I started using it back in July when it was only on the Windows fast ring, and then as it's come to slow ring and now toward release. So for those who don't know, the new WSL2 Windows Subsystem for Linux, the really fast one that I've been using for a while now, is coming. It's only been available on advanced versions of Windows that you have to be in the developer program to see. And they have a fast ring where you get lots of updates, which are, it's a very unstable environment to be in versus the slow ring, which is slightly less unstable to the release candidate, which is pretty stable, to Windows Prime, the Windows release that 99.9% of the world uses, which is the most stable. So I've been following it through all of that, and it's just gotten better and better. Along with, I should also mention an honorable mention for Windows Terminal. So Windows has come out with its own new terminal here, and a nice thing about this is I've got my local Ubuntu right here. I've got a remote Linux server right here. I can bring up PowerShell here as well. I can bring up Command as well. I can bring up Azure. So it's a mixed mode tool that allows me to use all the different platforms I use within the same scope.
So if you're running like Bash on Linux that you're SSH into, and you have a terminal open in VS Code, does it essentially proxy the Linux Bash? Like, does it emulate it perfectly, or is it somehow?
It does better than that.
Wrapping
It is Linux Bash. So when let me make sure I get the right window here. So this is my WSL window. When I have a terminal open here, it is Linux, period. This is Linux on my virtualized Ubuntu machine. When I am over here on my SSH machine to pub1dev, you can see down here in the lower left where my mouse is. When I am in a terminal here, sorry, I got too many things open. When I'm in this terminal, this is actually a terminal on pub1dev. So I am in Bash on that remote machine. So when I type htop here, you'll see that this is a 24-core server I am on. So this is a shared development machine that we all use. And you'll see T. Allen is here, but you'll see other Words developers are listed here. So it is actually full bash on the remote machine. So you'll see Donahue L is there, and N Victor, and Jose PD, N Victor. There's a whole bunch of developers doing things over here, not just me.
So if you switch your shell in this terminal session, then you would get it, like want to use K shell for some reason, then you'd get it, right? It's not
Yep.
like
Then
okay.
I've changed it fully on the remote machine. So I'm fully on the remote machine here. I am not on my machine at all in this terminal when I connect via SSH or WSL2. I am on that other environment.
Okay, thank you.
So it's been really cool to see it developed, and I've been involved with Microsoft, through comments and their GitHub issues. They've been very responsive. They've been working diligently to get the terminal better and better. Their goal is to finally replace PuTTY after all these years, which I don't know why they didn't just buy PuTTY years ago. It's like there's some Microsoft moves. If I was king of Microsoft, I would have bought PuTTY. I would have bought Windows Stat. There are 5 or 6 different utilities I would have just bought and thrown on every Windows machine. But so is life. Well, fantastic. Well, if there aren't any more questions right now, I'm always available. So if people want to get started or have any questions, you can always find me in the UPenn IT Slack or the Wharton Slack if you're a Wharton person. I'm on both pretty much all the time. And I'm more than willing to help out anywhere I can. And thank you all for coming.
Well, thank you, Tim. Appreciate it. Really good.
And feel free to hang out and chat.
Righty.